Welcome back to the Last Days Book Club. As we continue to read the book, I Will Die Free by Noble Alexander with K. Rizzo, the remarkable story dictated by the young Pastor Noble Alexander of his life in a Cuban prison, where he was determined to fight to stay alive and remain faithful to his Lord inside the very gates of hell. In our last reading of chapter 14, entitled The Family, Noble had a further encounter with Iraida after she had divorced him. It so troubled him that he smuggled a letter to her to demand her reason, and her answer devastated him. Because of his refusal to submit to the re-education plan, she and their son, she said, could no longer endure his stubbornness. She had accepted an offer of marriage to a captain in the Revolutionary Army, and his son had joined the Youth Communist Party. He fell into a deep depression, but his brethren in the prison church were there for him, and gradually he returned to what could be considered normal for the brutal prison life they endured. In addition to this, conditions at Boniato grew so bad for them that the church diminished to less than 30 members, and morale was very low. Again, the Holy Spirit intervened, and at one time, when the few worshippers were about to be punished, 10 of the members who had attended the worship disappeared when called out for a roll call, and that was going to make the punishment even worse. But suddenly, one by one, 50 non-Christian prisoners who had never worshipped with them stepped forward, claiming that each was one of the missing 10. As a result, the guards were unable to punish such a large group, and the church numbers swelled with all the other prisoners who had stepped up. God had provided. Also in this chapter, Noble was visited by 2 Adventist pastors who had heard of his activities in forming a prison church, and they had come to ordain him. They ordained him secretly in the prison courtyard during their visit, which, along with the unexpected increase in their church members, lifted his depression and gave him the strength to endure. We continue our reading today with chapter 15, entitled Waiting for Eternity. To foster love and squelch hate must be the second most challenging battle a Christian has to fight while incarcerated in a Cuban prison. The first being to stay alive. One of the champions of love was Sergio Bravo, a young prisoner of slight build and as agile as a professional athlete. He made it his daily mission to spread the principle of love triumphing over hate to anyone who would listen. You can rise above your natural human passions in your service for Christ, he claimed. Not a simple task, while living in an environment of deprivation, wanton cruelty, and brutish torment. Sergio lived on the 5th floor of circular number 3. Somehow, he had managed to have a small Bible, the size of a pack of cigarettes, smuggled into him. The treasure of his life, he guarded the book carefully. When not using it, he hid it in a hole he dug into the concrete wall next to his bunk. The book had survived a number of searches. Early one morning, the dreaded warning echoed throughout the gallery. "The guards are coming! Inspection! Startled awake, Sergio leaped from his bunk to his feet. As he rushed to the door of his cell, he noticed that the guard tower was opened. From his vantage point, he also saw something else that made his blood run cold. On each side of the entrance to the gallery, the guards had built 2 parallel walls of sandbags. Behind the bags, soldiers waited with machine guns and rifles. "Everybody, out!" an officer shouted over the public address system. "Inspection! Everybody, out!" At the same time, a company of soldiers bounded up the stairs. Already guards were prodding their prisoners with their bayonets toward the corridor of death that led to the courtyard. Once within shooting range of the guards behind the sandbag walls, the prisoners ran for their lives into the courtyard amid volleys of bullets. Many fell, wounded. There had been a successful prison break, the nightmare of every inmate, and every officer from the prison director down to the lowest ranking guard was out for blood. Furious at the damage to their reputations for operating a tight ship, they wanted revenge. Sergio ran down the steps 3 at a time. When he reached the 4th level, he realized that he'd left his Bible under the pillow the night before, instead of replacing it in the wall. The guards would definitely find it if he left it there. But if he returned for it, he would receive additional blows for exiting so slowly. He decided it would be worth the extra pain. He bounded up the stairs and down the corridor to his cell. 12 more steps, and he entered his cell. His heart pounding, he gasped for breath as he slipped the Bible into its protective spot. Congratulating himself for keeping it out of their reach, he ran from the cell. Alone in the hall, he raced the race of his lifetime down the stairs. The guards took aim and fired at him as if hunting a wild deer. 2 bullets in his lower left leg sent him crashing to the floor. He left a trail of blood behind as 2 guards dragged him from the gallery. At the hospital, the doctor on duty examined Sergio's injured leg, then conferred with other members of the surgical staff. The doctor turned back to Sergio, and then in a cold, matter-of-fact voice, he announced, "I could remove the bullet and restore your leg, but frankly, it would take more time and more medicine than I think it's worth. You have a choice, Bravo. Either allow me to amputate your leg or bleed to death. Which will it be?" In his pain-racked condition, Sergio agreed to the amputation. He survived, minus his right leg. When he returned to the gallery, Sergio continued preaching his message of love, not only with his words, but with his actions. Another man, known in the gallery for his compassion, was Pastor Gerardo Alvarez, though very few of those who knew him knew his real name. Instead, they knew him as the brother of the faith. A local elder, Gerardo had consecrated his life to the propagation of the Word of God. Even the non-believers saw Christ in the way he lived. And like Sergio, Gerardo made it his mission to teach us to love and not to hate our enemies. An older man with white hair, Gerardo arrived at Boniato prison along with hundreds of other prisoners and was confined to an already overcrowded gallery. He made his bed on the concrete floor beneath another prisoner's bunk. Each night, soldiers removed prisoners from the galleries and took them out to the firing wall and shot them. We who remained heard the centuries-old cries of Viva Cristo el Rey! Long live Christ the King! Before the rifle shots, and then silence. During these terrible moments, while we shook with fear, Gerardo would move about the gallery, laying a friendly hand on a quivering shoulder, repeating the soothing words, "Let not your heart be troubled. Our beloved brother is asleep in Jesus." He helped prisoners prepare to meet their deaths with courage, to look forward to the resurrection. Wherever he went, whatever life he touched, Gerardo left behind a trace of his faith, his optimism, and peace. During the day when the galleries were open, he moved from section to section, searching out the sick. He shared his meager food with them, washed their clothes, and did whatever possible to ease their misery. At worship time, Gerardo became militant in his zeal. Bunk by bunk, this white-haired saint invited each inmate to attend the meeting. "Come on," he'd say as he pulled them from their beds or lifted them from the floor. "Jesus is calling." When a prisoner hesitated, Gerardo would urge, "I'm waiting for you to begin the worship." No one could tell this loving man no. He preached with a primitive beauty and possessed a magnetic charm that drew people to him. His Christ-centered message gave many Christian men the strength to resist falling into the enemy's ranks or being devoured by the cancer of hate. One day, the prison director assembled the prisoners in our gallery. "It seems you're not carrying out the re-education plan," he bellowed. "This we cannot allow." Then he called in a garrison of special soldiers, trained to most effectively use the bayonet, the electric cane, clubs, and chains. A shower of blows fell on our heads and backs. Unified by fear, we felt one another's pain. One Friday evening, as we were returning from a long, hard day, working in a mosquito-infested swamp, we staggered back toward our circular. The seasonal storm clouds threatened above our heads, and the sergeant in charge screamed at us to run. Exhausted, undernourished, and sick with all kinds of diseases, we could barely walk, let alone run. "It is going to rain! Run!" he shouted, prodding the first man in line with the tip of his bayonet. Barely able to lift one foot in front of the other, the lead man stumbled forward, and the rest of us followed. "Run," I said. We tried to accommodate his command, but our efforts fell short of his expectations. Furious, he screamed at us, "Hurry up, you miserable worms!" The chief of the block whipped out his machete and began beating us and shouting for the other soldiers to do the same. The political instructor gave a signal, which unleashed the specially trained soldiers on us like a pack of hungry wolves. The shouting and cursing drew the attention of the prisoners in circulars 2 and 3. They gathered to watch. As the crippling blows fell, one of the prisoners in the line lifted his hands and his eyes toward heaven, and in a calm, clear voice said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing." No evidence of pain could be seen on his face. This infuriated his torturers all the more. The sergeant ripped the prisoner's shirt from his back. Then, with a vengeance driven by insane savagery, 4 of the soldiers beat the man to his knees. Blood flowed from his lacerated back. Yet he remained, with his eyes gazing heavenward, as if he could see beyond his drab prison surroundings, as if he stood before the very throne of God. The entire prison population watched as this giant of a man, Gerardo, prayed for his enemies, even as they beat him. The old prisoner's hat fell to the ground. A hush echoed throughout the area at the sight of the prisoner's full head of white hair. Gerardo, brother of the faith. Then he fainted. 2 soldiers picked him up and carried him to his circular, where they left him without any medical attention. Even before the riot, a natural animosity existed between the soldiers and the prison population, with the soldiers' attitudes ranging from surly, those who disliked their assignment at the prison, to sadistic, those who relished inflicting pain. Any attempt at friendliness on the part of a guard would automatically be suspect, and any overture a prisoner might make toward a guard would label the prisoner as an informer, a death knell. A strong sense of justice exists behind iron bars. Even with those imprisoned for theft, murder, and other legitimate crimes, the prison officials committed the ultimate injustice when they refused to set free the prisoner who had completed his sentence. Usually, when asked, the guard would say, "I have to wait for notification from the head office." So was the story of Brother Cordero. On September 10th, 1972, the last day of his 10-year prison term, they took Brother Cordero to the Pinar del Rios court, where Cuban officials tried and convicted him of trumped-up charges in order to keep him in prison. Later that day, the guard opened the gate to our gallery and led the sallow, gaunt prisoner down the narrow hall. Faces pressed against the barred windows in the iron doors to see who the prisoner might be. "It's Cordero." The whispered news traveled down the length of the corridor faster than the prisoner and his jailer ever could. A second message followed the first. "He's passed into eternity." An expression that meant one's release date had come and gone and he had not been freed. It meant he probably would never be freed. Always there would be other excuses, other accusations that would keep him a prisoner. The guard opened cell number 12, and Cordero stepped inside. The door clanged shut behind him. He removed his shirt and walked toward the barred window. Only slight cracks between the welded iron sheeting and the concrete walls allowed ventilation or light to enter the cell. Peering through the tiny crack, he stared out into the prison courtyard until the glaring yard lights replaced the setting sun. He told the brothers later that as he stood watching the day disappear, the day when he should have been set free, he thought of the beatings he'd endured over the last 10 years, of the maggot-ridden food he'd been forced to eat, of the humiliations and deprivations inflicted on him almost daily. What hope do I have, he wondered, of ever being freed? How can I continue to live, knowing that my days will be filled with more of the same treatment? I must do something, anything. 2 days later, a prison official stopped outside Cordero's cell and called his name. Cordero Rodriguez. The officer, his voice terse and abrupt, never glanced up from the piece of paper he held in his hand. "It's me," Cordero replied. The officer ordered the gallery guard to open the door. Immediately the guard obeyed. The door swung open and Cordero came out. "Follow me," the officer said. Cordero followed the soldier down the corridor and out of the gallery. Upon reaching headquarters, the officer took Cordero directly to the prison director's office, where the director ordered him to sit down. A group of soldiers stepped into the room behind Cordero, then closed the office door. The director leaned back in his chair, folded his hands on his stomach, and mockingly said, "From today forward, you're no longer to be classed as a political prisoner. You're now considered a common prisoner." Cordero leaped to his feet. "No!" he shouted. "You can't!" He didn't have time to finish his statement before the soldiers behind him grabbed him and began beating him. Cordero fought, but the unequal numbers and his weakened physical condition defeated him. Once they had subdued the prisoner, the guards forcibly dressed him in the blues of the common prisoner. To prevent him from removing the uniform, they bound his hands, then took him to gallery number 5 at the far end of the prison compound, a gallery constructed entirely on the ground. Upon reaching the damp and humid cell that was to become Cordero's new home, the guards untied his hands. The prisoner immediately shed the hated garment. The common prisoners couldn't understand why he would do such a thing. Their mentality was so totally different from that of the political prisoner jailed because of his principles instead of because of his greed. Water dripped constantly down on Cordero from the ceiling. Never cleaned or aired, everything in the cell was coated with grease, dirt, and mold. The temperatures climbed higher in Cordero's cell since it was located next to the kitchen facilities. Cordero decided to go on a hunger strike. At best, he might be able to demand better treatment, and at worst, he might die. At the same time, he wondered if the worst that could happen was really the worst. He spent 11 days on his hunger strike, but ended it when he realized that it would do no good. The common prisoners could not understand him, and it did nothing to strengthen the brethren. After beating him for not eating and for not wearing the uniform, the guards stripped him of his underwear and moved him to section 4, which was close to us. We devised a method of communication between our sections, which allowed us to speak with him daily. Early in the morning, 1 year after Cordero's sham trial, an officer announced, "I have come to inform you of your sentence." The officer eyed Cordero strangely as he spoke. He had lost so much weight during the year since the officer had last seen him that his chest and clavicle had formed one pointed bow, like a boat under construction. He stared out of deep, brown, sunken eyes. His pale, emaciated skin stretched leather-like across his jutting bones. He was a walking skeleton. "Ah, yes," Cordero whispered, his heartbeat accelerating with a glimmer of hope. "The sentence." Apparently unnerved by the prisoner's condition, the officer snapped, "It's 2 years," then wheeled about and marched double time from the gallery. Months later, the prison officials moved Cordero to the charity dungeon, a euphemism for the most filthy, despicable dungeon in the prison complex. He had just settled in when another officer informed him that there had been a mistake. "Your sentence is 3 years." From that moment on, Cordero realized that he would never leave the prison alive. His captors had no intention of ever setting him free. He would spend the rest of his life living from year to year, only to have his sentence increased. Originally, he had been jailed for giving food to a rebel. Since then, his crimes varied from participating in hunger strikes to being discovered hiding a piece of paper in his shoe. A simple peasant who had spent his youth working on a tobacco plantation, he knew that his only hope of survival was to get reinstated as a political prisoner. While he had been incarcerated with us, he had learned grammar, algebra, arithmetic, and the gospel of Christ, which he believed with all his heart. Each Christian must face Calvary. Solitary confinement was Cordero's. As days, weeks, and months passed, he reflected on all he had learned since his imprisonment began. The more he thought of his mates, the more he craved their companionship and their support. He needed the compassion and understanding he had found in the presence of the saints. One day, he came to a decision. He would go on strike again, demanding to be reclassified as a political prisoner. Already weakened by 2 earlier hunger strikes, his body slowly disintegrated into a bony frame, wrapped in a pale, smelly layer of wrinkled skin. He never made it back to our gallery. He entered the shadow of death on May 21st, 1975. The end of chapter 15 of I Will Die Free, entitled Waiting for Eternity.